Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Did anyone have any stories from World War I or World War II passed down to them? If so, what's the story? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My great-grandfather was in the trenches of World War I. His wife sewed him a coat because, well, trench warfare. The Salvation Army was running a program where they would get care packages from the States to soldiers in the war. So she handed the coat over to them to get to her husband. A month later, she saw some admin from the Salvation Army walking around wearing the coat. He called her a liar when she said she made the coat for her husband, at least up until the policeman overseeing the argument was convinced to cut a seam to reveal the letter and hidden money she sewed into the lining. The Salvation Army also charged my great-grandpa for hot coffee, while the Red Cross gave it to the soldiers for free. Yeah, my family doesn't donate to the Salvation Army. My grandpa's only World War II story involves him arriving in France and proceeding to trip over a small hole in the ground and break his ankle on the first day there. It never healed right, and he was sent back to the States, walked with a cane for the rest of his life. My grandfather was one of the soldiers that stormed the beaches of Normandy. I didn't hear about that particular portion of his story, but I do know that he was under fire and jumped into the trench only to land on a dead soldier's body. The corpse still smelled of a cologne called Evening in Paris, and when Grandpa came home to the States, he couldn't stand the smell of Evening in Paris. It caused severe PTSD flashbacks for him. I wish I knew more of his story, but he's been missing over 20 years now and is presumed dead. One grandfather earned a Purple Heart during World War I because he went out alone under heavy shelling to flag down an ambulance for his buddies. The physician who later treated him at the field hospital said his own leg was torn up so badly he shouldn't have been able to take 10 steps on it. Ultimately, he didn't save any lives though, and the ambulance got shelled too, killing the entire ambulance crew. He was the sole survivor. Great-grandfather earned his commission during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. He was Company Sergeant Major 25th CEF. During the battle, his major and platoon commanders were either wounded or killed. He took charge of the company, and after storming and taking the village, he continued to lead his men until another 100 yards of German trenches were captured and held for 2 days and 2 nights. He fought at Ypres and the Somme, and several other battles during World War I. I have his uniform, medals, walking stick, battlefield maps, field binoculars, photos, etc. Awesome. My grandfather was in the US Navy in the Pacific during World War II. My mom would tell me about how, when she was a kid, he'd used to get really drunk and tell disturbing, graphically detailed stories about all the horrific shit he witnessed during the war. Stories about friends drowning or getting burned to death in raging fires, the terror caused by incoming kamikazes, etc. My mom was like 8 or 9 years old at the time, and being subjected to that understandably messed her up a bit. I never worked up the nerve to ask my grandfather about his experiences directly, since it was obviously so traumatic for him. He eventually died due to complications from Parkinson's disease, as well as being an alcoholic for decades. I sometimes wonder how different his life might have been if he hadn't enlisted as a fresh-faced 17-year-old. Given the timing, he might have been able to avoid getting drafted and stay out of the war entirely. Shoulda, coulda, woulda, I guess. A couple distant, was a leader in the Danish resistance. His trench coat is in the Resistance Museum of Copenhagen. All the bullet holes are marked, some where he was shot, a bunch of others where he shot through the coat during assassinations. My Nana told me everything she remembered before she passed when I was younger. Wildest thing in the world to actually go and see the coat. While I have several family members who died in action, here are the more interesting stories. My great-grandparents with 7 children were living in Russia under Nazi occupation, hiding a Jewish woman in their cellar. Their neighbors knew about it, but none of them snitched. The entire family would have been gunned down if they did. Also, a bomb once fell on their house, but everyone survived, although my great-grandfather was severely injured. Great-grandma secretly raised a chicken for him to eat for his injury, as they were starving because the Nazis were raiding the village for food. On one such raid, she denied having any food, but they heard the chicken clucking. That's probably the nearest the family got to being shot. A story my grandfather always told us, one of my great-uncles was in the resistance. His older brother was collaborating with the Nazis. When the first brother was arrested, the other one went to prison and forced him to switch clothes. The younger brother could escape, but the Nazis didn't believe that the older brother had been overpowered. They sent him to a concentration camp, but he survived. He never recovered though and died a couple of years after the war. Grandfather and great-grandfather. At start of World War II, they lived in southern Poland. War broke out. Commies went in and Ukrainian bad guys at the time just slaughtered half of their village and the rest of them sent into Siberia. To state, at the time, same Poles and Ukrainians were slaughtering each other, so I don't think I call them bad guys only 'cause that. My grandfathers were sent to Siberia when grandfather was not even adult. They worked there in slavery until H invaded USSR. Then USSR agreed to form Polish army in USSR to fight them. My great-grandfather went easily. He was strong, etc. My grandfather still was not adult, and they didn't want to take him. He hid behind stockpiles of coal and jumped into the train just in time. But they stopped him because they told him he is too young. And then some stranger appeared and told he is an adult and he knew him, just lost his documents. They saw each other for the first time. Later on, when the army was formed, USSR changed their mind and told General to go back to Gulag. Of course, they did not and fled into Iran, and then they landed in Europe. Great-grandfather fell ill at some point in England, so my grandfather went alone from this point. He was at a Polish parachute division under General Sosabowski, and the mission Market Garden also, called Battle of Arnhem. Unfortunately, Germans knew what was coming, and they had the upper hand. Dad told me his grandfather said, "Germans just fired at us like we were effing ducks." The battle was lost, and after survival, they came back to England. Later in 1945, they were in occupying forces in Germany until 1947. After all of that, both grandfathers returned to Poland, built the house in which I live and lived in, nice life, and were respected in the community. Grandfather died 10 years before I was born, but my dad told me some stories. My uncle was in the Navy and served in the Pacific Theater. He always talked about how they'd see sharks and shoot them. He got kind of giddy, storytelling face and kapow, fake shoot a shark. He had an old school shark with X eyes tattoo. He didn't really talk much about battles, which ship, or why he hated sharks. But as I'm older, I think it had to do with ships that sank and people he lost. A patient admitted he was a Nazi war criminal a few days before he died. Took part in massacres of Jewish shtetls. "I'm a murderer. It's all I am." We had talked about being in the army. I was too, of course not World War II, and he just let it all out. He knew he was dying. I feel like he never told anyone that but me. Seeing him with his wife and kids and grandkids at his bedside while he was slipping away was more surreal than most other times I've seen it. There was an old man who lived across the street from my wife's childhood home. He was crabby some days, but for the most part, he was an interesting, jovial man who was neat to talk to. I'm not sure why, but one day he told me he was in World War II. He told me he was stationed at a base or airstrip in Italy. When the bombers would return, the men on the ground would have to man anti-aircraft weapons in case the bombers were followed by German aircraft. He told me that the bombers would return full of holes, and how he could remember seeing the blood from the crew streaking the side of the plane from leaking out of bullet holes, sometimes even dripping blood into the runway. In that moment, the jovial old man I knew was gone and replaced by a person reliving his trauma. No one else I asked really knew that about him. This is World War I. My granddad, we'll call him George, was performing an attack with the rest of his regiment over no man's land. He was being shot at quite a lot. He was shot in the left part of his chest. The bullet did not go into his body, it landed in his cigarette tin and did not harm him. He saved the bullet, and it has passed down the family. My dad even used to play with it as a toy with his action figures. Both of my mom's parents were involved with World War II. My grandpa grew up in Dayton, Ohio. He was drafted into the army and was trained as a medic for the 93rd Evac Hospital. They were sent to Europe for World War II. I think my mom said he mostly drove ambulances. My grandma grew up in the USSR. Her father was taken away by Stalin when she was young. He just didn't come home one night. When she was 17, She was taken from her home by the Germans and sent to a work camp where they made mattresses. She was kept alive because she could translate for the Germans. Eventually, the Germans left, and the American hospital unit came in and liberated the camp, and my grandpa was put in charge of the Russian girls, and that is how they met. They got married in Brussels in 1945 after the war ended. My grandpa went home while my grandma had to stay behind until the paperwork went through. They wrote letters to each other. My mom still had all of them. They lived the rest of their lives in Dayton. My grandpa became a house painter, and my grandma became a seamstress, making slipcovers for people. They had and lost 2 children before they had my mom. I'm named after my mom's sister, who passed away when she was 9. Unfortunately, I don't remember them. They both passed away in the early 90s when I was very young, but I'm still proud to be their granddaughter. Oh, and don't worry, my mom is writing their story. I poke her about it every once in a while, since she's the only one who can write their story. My father was supposed to be on a ship called Rona. You can read about it in Wikipedia, but essentially the ship was a casualty of a Nazi-guided bomb. The reason my father did not get on the ship was one of the sergeants of his platoon forgot the paperwork to get the platoon on the ship. The entire platoon was pulled out of line, and the next group in line got in while the sergeant got the paperwork. If not for the sergeant's mistake, I would have never been born. Growing up, I was always told my grandfather wasn't in combat during World War II. My grandfather told me Dad he initially enlisted in the airborne, but washed out due to not being able to do a certain exercise. After this, he said he was sent to work with heavy machinery because of his experience with operating heavy farming equipment. Turns out, my grandfather not only saw combat, but he saw some of the worst of it. Every Friday, my grandfather would go over to my uncle's oldest kid's house and drink coffee with him and tell him his war stories. My uncle relayed this information to me years after my grandfather had died. My grandfather was transferred to the 18th Infantry Regiment after he washed out of airborne school. Although his unit took minimal casualties in the day invasion of Normandy, he saw a lot. He saw constant combat for nearly the next 2 years. He survived D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Battle of Aachen, and the Hurtgen Forest. Unfortunately, it was the Hurtgen Forest where most of his unit was killed. I can't remember the specifics, but my grandfather was on a leave pass or something when the Germans launched an offensive. He only found out when he was trying to return to his unit and learned he'd been transferred to another because his was wiped out. He lost some of his best friends in that battle. My uncle asked my grandfather one day why he was telling him all this and why he had never told anyone about it. My grandmother didn't even know. They met after the war. My grandfather said, "I just figured someone should know." After the war, my grandfather did go into operating heavy machinery in the Army and became first-generation Air Force. My grandfather suffered from major PTSD and was an alcoholic for years, but was sober by the time I was born. I'm his namesake, and I wear my name proudly. I loved my grandfather so much, and it broke my heart when he died. On his deathbed, he was reliving memories from the war. He would talk about crossing a river and some other stuff. I attended his funeral in my Air Force blues. P.S. To give you an idea what a great man my grandfather was, he convinced my other uncle to dress up as Santa Claus for us kids on Christmas Eve. My grandfather bankrolled the whole operation every Christmas, and it's some of my fondest memories. My grandfather had a neighbor that was poor and couldn't afford presents during Christmas. In the words of my uncle, he said, "Here's some money, go buy some presents for those damn kids and dress up as Santa Claus when you give them." After a while, my grandfather had my uncle delivering presents for half a dozen families every Christmas. I continued the tradition with my kids, nieces, and nephews every Christmas Eve. Good man.